Phew, didn't get too far in. So it's lesson 6. We're looking at web application security with ASP.NET Identity. When I go to create a new project, by default under authentication, the default setting is no authentication. So if I build a project this way, we don't have any of the ASP.NET Identity libraries. Once I change it to use individual user accounts, when we go ahead and finish creating the project, yes, Liam, I did. Once I do this, this automatically adds all the libraries that we need and some starter code into our project. So I'll create a project with none, with no authentication, and then we can compare some of the things that we have in our video game store and you have in your assignment that we wouldn't have in a project with no authentication. So by choosing authentication, we get some of these libraries added to our project. Now there's a great tutorial here from Microsoft. I've included this link on Blackboard for you as well. The link is down here. So it's about an hour. So some of the things we're going to do today are kind of based on that tutorial, but these are the official documents that you can always use direct from Microsoft as a reference. These slides are on Blackboard. So our ASP.NET Identity, it takes care of both authentication as well as authorization. Now we did authentication in our PHP course, but we didn't really do authorization. What's the difference between these two and how are they related? They're related, but they're different. How would you define authentication and how would you define authorization? What do they mean? This is a great job interview question for a web developer, by the way. Okay, right, Liam. So authentication is about your identity. It's about, do you have valid login credentials? So who are you? Yep, that's a good way of putting it. Great answer. Okay, Ivan, that really helps as well. Right, so authentication is who are you? And authorization is, now that we know who you are, what are you allowed to do? So authentication is really the first level of security. And for some applications, that's all we need. We simply need users to have logins. But every user within the application can do the same things. That's kind of a simple security model. So the most basic security model, we have authentication, but we don't have authorization. So authorization is that second level. Once you're able to log in, we need to know what level of permission do you have? What are you allowed to do in the application? So we've got identity handles both authentication with either a username and an authentication type. So we're going to store, for this week, we're going to store usernames and passwords in our database. Next week, we're also going to look at authenticating through a third-party service like Google or Facebook sign-in. And then authorization is that second level that says, once we know a user's identity, once they've authenticated, what role or roles do they belong to? And those roles will determine what they can see and what they can do within the application. So eventually in our video game store, we basically want to have 3 different types of users. We want to have anonymous users that can just come to the site and browse. We want to have customers that can check out and make an order. And we want to have administrators that can manage the categories and products in the store. So we're going to have these 3 different user types. So we're going to start with authentication today. And then we should also be able to add a customer and an administrator role and set up different rules so that they can see and do different things within our game store. And the identity library kind of makes this easy. So when we create it, I'm actually just going to open up. So I'm going to have two projects open today. So here's my project with no authentication. I'm also going to open up our game store so that we can kind of compare and contrast what did we get in our game store. Here's what code and libraries do our video game store have that a project with where I chose no authentication doesn't have. So one of the other great things that the ASP.NET Identity library does is it automatically builds tables in our database for managing users and roles. Okay? And all of these tables start with the prefix ASP.NET. So I've got this diagram on the slides, a little hard to read. I've also put a larger version of this diagram up here on Blackboard. So these tables will get created for us automatically when we run a migration in our database. So the main table we're concerned with is the ASP.NET users table. So this is where user accounts will get stored. And it has things like a hashed password. It also has who mentioned two-factor authentication in our poll. Okay, that's great, Hung. So one of the properties in this table is whether we are enabling two-factor authentication. We can lock out accounts. We can also set up whether users have to confirm their email before they're allowed to use their account. So there's an email confirmed. We've got a table for roles. So every application, we can create the roles in this table. We'll do this later today. We want to set up a customer role and an admin role. Then we've got a junction table, a user roles. So this table indicates which user is in which role. We've also got a user logins table to track users that are logged in through a third-party service, like a Google account, for example. We won't use all these tables, but these are here by default. So when we created our Get Me a Game project, in the data and migrations, we created most of these migrations ourselves, except the original migration. You'll notice here that's 0000 create identity schema. So this migration is automatically created in your project if we choose the authentication option, individual user accounts, we set up the project. So the migration is creating all of these tables. Create table, roles, create table, users. So this migration code gets built into our project automatically. And as soon as we run update database, our database is going to get these tables created. In a project where we chose no authentication, you'll notice I don't even have that data folder. So we have no data and no migrations. So this means if we want to add security to our project, it's much easier to add it when we create the project. If we create a project with no authentication like this one, we have an awful lot of work to do to go and add it in after the fact. Almost better to just rebuild a new project and add security from the beginning in that case. And these tables we can see, they're in our video game store database. If I connect to my video game store on Azure, we will see all of the ASP.NET identity tables here. So here's my game store database, and you can see I've got all the tables that start with ASP.NET. Now these tables are blank. We haven't used them yet, but we'll start using them today. And your database would have the same tables. So a few of the main classes that we work with are the identity user that stores user information and it's mapped to the Asp Net users table, and the identity role class is mapped to the user roles. So which user is in which role. Also, if we look in our startup file, we can see that some of the security options are already configured for us. Now we're going to change one of them. So we're going to go to our startup.cs file in our game store. Now we haven't made any changes to this file. It was just auto-generated. Inside the configure services method, which should be on line 28, it should be exactly the same line for you as it is for me. Lines 33 and 34, this is where our application is configuring our database to manage authentication of our users. So we're saying we're adding identity, and it actually sets up that the default is that users need to confirm their email before they can sign in. We're going to change that for today because we don't have a working mail server right now that will send out a confirmation email. So on line 33, where my cursor is flashing and I've got the word true, I want to change that to false. So a user does not have to get a confirmation email before they can sign in. Now, if we're only going to allow users to log in, where we're basically just doing authentication, but if we weren't doing authorization with roles, this code that's here is fine. If we want, however, to allow for different roles in our application, we need to enable that here as well. So before line 34, after line 33, I'm going to put in a dot and we want to add this dot add roles identity role. So this is going to allow our application not only to do authentication, but also to do authorization. It's only set up to handle authentication, the first level, by default. So I'll paste this whole line of code into the chat. So I've changed true to false. We're not going to confirm by email new registrations. And we want to enable roles for individual users. So what we want is every time somebody registers, we automatically want to make them a customer. We're going to manually create in one admin account, and then everyone else that registers will be a customer. So they can shop and they can check out, but they can't manage the product catalog because that's going to be an administrator-only function. And then ASP.NET makes it really easy in our controllers and our views for us to control access. So if, for example, we want to make a whole controller or an individual method in the controller, let's say we want it to be not public, that someone has to log in order to be able to access it. We simply add above the method, we add the keyword authorize in square brackets. That would now mean that anybody who is not logged in can't access it. If we make our whole controller private, but we want to allow access to a method inside of it, we would add allow anonymous above the method name. That would make it public. And then inside of a view, maybe we have some code that should only run, or something that should only be visible to somebody who's logged in. But anonymous users shouldn't be able to see that. We can just check if our user's logged in using this code. We check our user object if their identity is authenticated. If it returns true, the user is logged in. If it returns false, the user is anonymous. So that way we can show or hide visual elements in our application this way. So these checks, this would be for authentication. Make something private, make something public, and then in a view, check if the user is logged in or anonymous. That's our first level. So we're going to implement this first. And once we have this working, we're going to add the second level, authorization. And they would look like this. In a controller or method, we would still use the authorize keyword, but then we would specify what role or roles are allowed in. So we could allow multiple roles into a controller, into a method. And if in a view, we didn't just want to check if the user was logged in or not, we wanted to know, were they in a particular role? We could use user.identity.isInRole. And then we just specify the name of the role. So the amount of coding we have to do to start to control access is really limited because we created our project with authentication. So most of the code that we need is handled by the identity library. So let's try this out. I'm going to start the server. The other things that we can see in our project that indicate we have security set up with the identity library. In my project, if I open up the dependencies and packages, we'll see that we have dependencies on Microsoft.ASP.NET Core.Identity and Microsoft.ASP.NET Core.Identity.Entity Framework Core. So when we choose those security options at startup, these are the two libraries that will write most of the code, and they get added to our project automatically. In my new project that I created here with no security, you'll notice I don't have any of those libraries here. It just is just a basic .NET Core app. So it does not use these libraries at all. So I'm going to go to the video game shop. We finished customizing it a bit last week. So you notice we have these register and login links. Let's actually try them and see what happens. No, I know it doesn't. They're in there, Justin, but it's differently. They're in there differently. So I'm going to go to register. And let's try and create this account. I'm going to put the credentials in. Let's create customer1 at gc.ca, and we'll try the password test. Now, right away, you'll notice it says my password has to be between 6 and 100 characters long. So it's not going to let me register with a really weak password. So I'll try the password test. Well, we'll try test and test first, Liam. I'll just put in what I'm trying in the chat. So the identity library includes rules around strong passwords. we've got to have at least one non-alpha character and at least one digit and at least one uppercase. So that we don't forget our logins, let's all create this account with this same password. I'll put it in the chat. Capital T, EST, 1, 2, 3, and a $sign. So I will have met all the rules. It's at least 6 characters. I have an uppercase, a lowercase, a digit, and a special character. So I'm going to click register. And now notice my header, my register and login links have disappeared. It says I'm logged in using my customer1@gc.ca account. If I go to my database, I can query my Asp Net users table. And the identity library has created a record. My ID is a long string. It's got my username. My email is not confirmed because we changed that to false. It hashes the password and also uses a security stamp. So if different users use the same password, each one will be stored as a unique value. Farouk, if you leave it to true, you can register, but you're going to get a page saying the email. So it would register you, but you wouldn't be able to log in. And it will show you a page saying can't send the confirmation email because we don't have a mail server configured. So for our purposes, I set it to false. Two-factor auth is not enabled for now. So now I should be able to log out and then log back in with this same account. So now I can log back in. Now it's important to note that by default, identities logins use cookies. They use an encrypted cookie, which means my login will persist across different browser sessions. If I close my browser and open it back up, I'm still going to be logged in. Okay? Now you can change the settings. So those settings, if you want to configure it, the cookie, you can configure it in startup. So for example, if you want to change the cookie expiry so that the login cookies, the login persists for a shorter period of time. So you have the ability to overwrite how those are set. Yes, it is, Justin. So now I'm going to log out. I'm going to go to register again. And I'm going to try the same email address. So I'll try the same credential a second time. And the identity library automatically blocks me from doing this. Before it registers a new account, it's checking to make sure that username doesn't already exist. So we don't have to do any coding of our own to prevent duplicate users. The library does it. So it hashes the password, it enforces strong password rules, and it will check for duplicate users for us. So again, Microsoft has tried to take work out of our hands, knowing that these are kinds of things that pretty much any application is going to need. So now that we've got a basic account, what I want to do, so I'm logged out right now. So over the last few weeks, we have this categories and we've got products controllers, right? And each of these have all of the scaffolded views for doing create, read, update, and delete. But right now, everything is public. So what I want to do is I want to change the authentication in my controllers so that a user has to be logged in before they can access them. And then we'll also look at this allow anonymous feature, so we can make one method inside the controller public, but the rest of the controller will be private. So we'll go to our categories controller, close a few things up here. I'm going to open up my categories controller. So we can make things private either one method at a time, or we could decide everything in this controller is private. So to make everything in the controller private, right here above my class on line 13, I can simply add this decorator in square brackets. If I add the decorator authorize, turns light blue. So put it right above your public class categories controller. So you can see it on my line 14. I'm going to save that change. And now, whoops, I'm logged out of the site because I can see register and login. I'm going to try my categories URL again. So now I'm hitting refresh to try and reload the index method of the categories controller. And my authorize line says, yep, you're not authorized, and it automatically sends me to the login screen. And I can see in the URL, it says return URL equals categories. So this means I know that I can see this was the page I tried to access, but instead it sent me here, identity account login. So with this return URL, if I log in, it will now take me to categories. So now that I log in, it loads it. I'll log out again, and I'll try to access other views in categories. I'll go to categories / create. Again, I'm locked. I have to log in. Categories, so I'll go /edit, and I'll put in a category ID. So all of the methods are now private. The only way I can access them is to log in. So we've really done almost nothing here. The only things we've modified are our startup, here and here, and we've added one word to the controller, which is super efficient and easy. So by putting the authorize up here, this makes all the methods in the controller private. Now we might want this. We might only want a few methods private and a few public. So in that case, we could put authorize instead of up here. We could put authorize above just the individual methods that require authentication. That would work as well. We also have the ability, even though we've made our whole controller private, let's say we want to make one method inside it public. So here we've got down on line 31, here's our details method. So this method, it's read only. The user can't actually change anything. If I log back in, we can see it. So I'll go back to categories. I'll click details beside one of my, so all it does is show us the name, but there's no ability for users to add or change anything here. So maybe we want to make the details method public. Anonymous users can see the category details, but they can't create, edit, or delete. Right now, so I'll just grab that URL. If I log out, right, I can't get to my details screen right now because it's in the controller, and everything in the controller requires authentication. So I'm going to override the authentication in my details method. So down here, I'm going to add the allow anonymous decorator. So if we put allow anonymous above details, this will make our details method public. All the other methods in the controller are still private, but not details. So we'll try this out. So I've added line 31 to my categories controller. So I'm still anonymous right now. If I try to load my list of categories, I'm blocked. But if I want to load categories details, this page I should be able to load. I'm not logged in, but my details method only is public. If I click one of these links, now I get bounced back to the login screen because I can't go to index and I can't go to edit if I'm anonymous. So we have full kind of granular control, either at the controller level, but also at the individual method level, whether these items should be public or private. And all we need to do to control that is use authorize and allow anonymous. Now, this is only dealing with authentication, with who is the user. Are they logged into the site, or are they anonymous? This doesn't deal with what role and permission do they have. So authentication, as we said, is sort of the first level. So let's add one more quick thing here, and then we'll take a break. Let's add to our navigation bar categories and products links, but only for users who are logged in. So an anonymous user won't see them, but someone who logs in will see them in their nav bar. So where would we go to add those links? What file should we modify? Yep, thanks, Farouk. So let's open up our layout file. Under Views, Shared and Layout. So we've got one link here that says Shop Now. We'll change that link later. So I'm going to copy it and add two new links. The first one, the controller, is categories, but I'll change the link text from Shop Now to categories. And for the second one, I'll change the controller to products, and our link can say products. So we're going to add these links, but we want them visible only when someone is logged in. An anonymous user can't see them. So we're going to wrap these two links inside of an if statement. So we can use the user class that comes with identity. If our user.identity.is authenticated, and I'm going to move my closing curly brace here. I'll put all this in the chat as well. Okay, so I've highlighted all the new code in blue. Lines 28 to 35 on my screen, right underneath our Shop Now link. So add that code to your layout file. Then we can try it out in the browser. So when we're an anonymous user, we will only see a Shop Now link. If we log into the site, we'll then also get a categories and product link appearing in our nav bar. As soon as we log out, the categories link and the product link should disappear because our identity will no longer be authenticated. So I'll just scroll this up and try to load my browser so you can still see the code. So right now I'm anonymous. So when I go back to my home page, I still only see the Shop Now link. The categories and products aren't here. If I log in, now categories and products are here. And if I log out, these two links should go away again. Now, once again, I'm anonymous. So that's really all there is to the authentication piece. So long as we choose the authentication option when we're creating our project, Visual Studio really does about 90% of the work. It builds the tables in our database, it adds the libraries we need, it builds our register and login forms, it enforces strong passwords, it hashes them, it checks for duplicate usernames, and all we really need to do to control the access is add authorize or allow anonymous in our controller. And if we want to control access to something in the view, we can just check for an identity with if user.identity.is authenticated. Yeah, Liam, I agree. I think it does make it really easy for us. We don't have to write a lot of code in order to get this functionality working. So we've done kind of step one of this. There's really sort of three parts to our lesson over the next 2 weeks. Step one was implementing basic authentication. We're pretty much done, and we've really only added a few lines of code to do this. And we've leveraged the identity library. Step two is to add authorization, where we have different roles and different types of users. And we're going to modify some of what we've done in the next hour of class. Instead of just checking for identity, we're actually going to want to check what role is the user in. And administrators and customers are going to be able to do different things. Then next week, we're going to deal with this part, this using another service to register by configuring some external providers. So we can sign in with, let's say, a Google, a Facebook, maybe even a Microsoft account as an alternative to a username and password that's stored in our own database. Okay, so we'll get into that next week. And then these are basically the things you'll have to do for assignment 2A, is take the project that you made for assignment 1B, where everything is public, and you're going to implement the identity library to control access to it. We'll talk more about that. I'll give out that assignment next week, and you'll have several weeks to work on it. Okay, it's 11:56 by my clock. So I'm going to stop the recording and take a pause here and go throw my coffee maker on, and we will resume in 10 minutes. I will also push what we've done so far to GitHub in case anybody needs it for reference. Yes, Diana, you will. Yes, I prefer that